Empires don't fall because of enemy attacks, but because of people who are too sure they can't be wrong. Sometimes it's not a conspiracy or a disaster that brings everything down. It's just one order, one person who only believes in themselves. They ignore warnings, overlook limits, and don't feel the edge. And a vast system, built over generations, crumbles under their arrogance. Rome moved through the world as if it were their own home. Roads, laws, and the army. Everything worked smoothly and firmly. They thought that if they won here once, they could win anywhere. But in the damp northern forest, their order lost its meaning. The commander believed he knew the enemy better than the enemy knew themselves. He thought the empire's authority mattered more than the reality beneath his feet. He was undeterred by the unfamiliar terrain, strange paths, or unsettling details. Where he should have doubted, he rushed ahead. Where he should have double-checked his ally, he simply trusted. The forest, the ravines, the fog, the narrow paths, all of it formed a trap. The legions marched in like they were in a hallway, confident that their formation was stronger than any trick. 3 legions nearly vanished completely. With them, the idea that Rome could swallow the entire north disappeared. The border, which was considered temporary just yesterday, became permanent. Not because the enemy was incredibly strong, but because someone up top decided, since we are an empire, the world must bend to our plans. The map of Europe didn't change right away, but that was where an invisible limit was set. Centuries later, a similar story unfolded in another world, in the luxury of Persian palaces. The Persian Empire of Xerxes loomed over the region like a mountain. Vast lands, gold, armies, ships. Against this backdrop, the Greek cities seemed like a minor annoyance. In the empire's strongholds, it felt like the outcome was already clear. The mass of people and ships seemed like a solid argument. If you have more, you are right. If you are stronger, victory is just a matter of time. Xerxes saw his forces as an unstoppable wave. But the sea he directed that wave into followed different rules. The decision to corner the enemy in a narrow strait looked logical on paper, among numbers and diagrams. There were no winds, no currents, and no crowding there. In reality, the bulky fleet hit a wall of space. Ships began to get in each other's way, losing formation and blocking their own maneuvers. Where the empire hoped to overwhelm with numbers, it got stuck in its own size. The defeat at Salamis struck not just at military strength, but at its image. Persia no longer seemed unstoppable. The fear of its armies started to fade. People around and within the empire began to notice. This machine could be stopped. On the surface, it still looked massive, but the cracks were already showing. And into that crack, other armies and ambitions would later step in. Xerxes' mistake became a long echo that haunted the empire for many years. Further along that same sea, on its eastern edge, lived another heir to greatness, Byzantium. It liked to think of itself as the survivor, an empire that endured division, invasions, conspiracies, and religious disputes. Most military geniuses became legends simply because no one was there to openly call their mistakes mistakes. Empires don't acknowledge their mistakes, they preserve them. In gold, velvet, and marble, victories aren't the only things on display. The walls of palaces and museums hold the consequences of others' miscalculations. It's where luck has turned away, but admitting that is too shameful. Official speeches don't mention it. They showcase medals, banners, and armor. They talk about marches, heroism, and glory. But the cost of wrong decisions is often left unspoken. Strip away the shine, and the picture becomes harsh. Behind every sword and flag, there's a clear yes or no. Some overestimated their strength. Others didn't consider the terrain, climate, or season. Some refused to retreat when they still could. But it wasn't the signers who paid the price. It was those who moved forward, believing the plan was well thought out. History often presents wars as a series of victorious dates. But war is also a graveyard of mistakes. Failed campaigns, disrupted supplies, failed intelligence, and wrong choices in attack direction. Almost every campaign has a moment when things go off the rails. These episodes are often hidden behind neutral words and convenient explanations. In reports, they look like minor deviations from the plan. In reality, they mark the point where there's no one left to save. The first layer of evidence is the texts: chronicles, reports, dispatches, and letters. They almost never say outright, "We made a mistake." Instead, you find phrases like, "We ran out of supplies," "Reinforcements were delayed," or "The resistance was stronger than expected." Smooth phrases hide thousands of lives lost and cities burned. The phrase, "They set out without enough food supplies," sounds calm, but behind it lies a complete failure in basic planning. The line, "The troops did not expect an ambush," breaks down the entire command system. Intelligence failed, the leadership underestimated the enemy, and people marched into a trap. On paper, it's just a technical note. In reality, it's a convoy entering a gorge and never coming out. Sometimes, a disaster comes down to a single line in a report. The bridge was too narrow during the evacuation. This dry wording hides the panic, the chaos, and the loss of life in the water. Someone failed to plan an escape route and didn't check how thousands would leave. In the document, it's a nearly invisible detail. In real life, it means empty homes and names that are never spoken again. Paperwork patiently smooths over the sharp edges. Part of the blame gets lost in phrases like complex situation, unfavorable conditions, and changing circumstances. So, the mistake turns into what seems like a natural course of events. Any text is the perspective of a survivor. The author protects themselves and their superiors. They shift some of the blame and choose softer words. A lot is presented as a series of unfortunate events or unexpected challenges. But war rarely offers such gifts. That's where the land comes into play. Archaeologists arrive at places where the chronicles have already crafted a convenient version. Ruined cities don't need fancy words. Often, it's not an enemy army that brings down an empire, but one person who decides that losing isn't an option. This idea always sounds appealing. It's presented as willpower, a special mission, or the destiny of a nation. It's repeated in speeches, woven into toasts, and whispered in the hallways. A circle of people quickly forms around it, whose job is to validate this perspective. Ministers, military leaders, and courtiers start living by one rule: reality must match the leader's expectations. At some point, there's no one left around him who dares to say, "This isn't right." The confidence at the top stops being just a personality trait. It becomes the operating mode for the entire system of power. At first, it seems effective. Decisiveness, quick actions, bold decisions. Doubts feel like a hindrance, an unnecessary burden. But gradually, the very language to discuss risks disappears. Any attempt to ask a question sounds like a challenge. The louder the past successes, the more dangerous the question, "What if we are wrong?" becomes. Where mistakes are not allowed from above, the truth is silenced from below. The Persian Empire during Xerxes' time already operated by these rules. Its territory stretched for thousands of kilometers. The treasury was filled with enough resources for long campaigns. At the court, a simple reflex took hold. Agreement was safer than analysis. Officials and military leaders learned not to evaluate, but to twist the facts to fit the desired conclusion. There was only one line: the king is strong. The king is right. The king never fails. Any serious setback was out of the question. It was uncomfortable even to think about it. In this state, the empire was preparing for the campaign against Greece. On paper, everything looked perfect. Huge forces were brought under a single command. Bridges were being built, a fleet was being gathered, and routes were being planned. The scale was supposed to be overwhelming on its own. Within the empire, the Greeks seemed like an obstacle in the grand scheme, not a worthy opponent capable of a fair fight. The main idea was simple: numbers and resources solve any problem. But real war doesn't fit this logic. The narrow strait at Salamis turns Persian superiority into a heavy burden. Ships get in each other's way, command falls apart, and there's hardly any room to maneuver. That one detail, which was overlooked, becomes the key to the battle's outcome. The fleet, invested with hope and prestige, faces a defeat that the Persian elite never even considered as a possible outcome. Formally, the empire is still standing. Vast territories remain under control. Xerxes' power is intact. But the blow strikes not at the borders, but at the foundation of obedience. The myth that the ruler is always right is crumbling. Subjects see that the person on the throne can make mistakes. This doesn't immediately change the political system, but it shifts the internal perspective on it. Obedience, based on faith in infallibility, no longer feels so natural. Any new failure in management starts to be seen not as a coincidence, but as a symptom. Centuries later, a similar story unfolds in Europe. Napoleon initially rises through careful calculation. He views the battlefield more broadly. An empire rarely falls from outside blows. It often prevents itself from thinking. By the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire appears solid and calm. Cities are under control, trade is thriving, the treasury is not empty, and the chronicles confidently recount past victories. In Istanbul, people believe that the system has proven itself, and touching it is dangerous, almost sacrilegious. Anyone who doubts it automatically becomes suspicious and untrustworthy. At the heart of this calm are the Janissaries. Chosen from childhood, trained, and isolated within their own circle, they have been seen as the ideal soldiers for decades. The Sultan relies on them, the citizens look to them, and their name is a promise. If a threat arises, we will call upon them, and everything will be resolved. While Istanbul is repeating this formula, life in Europe is moving in a different direction. There, they are rewriting regulations, changing military structures, and officers are studying new textbooks and analyzing foreign campaigns step by step. Artillery is becoming more precise and mobile, while infantry is turning into a well-drilled mechanism with clear rhythms, signals, and discipline. Countries are spending money not just on guns and gunpowder. They are investing in military schools, training grounds, regular exercises, and personnel development. War stops being a continuation of old glory. It becomes a separate profession that requires years of training. This is where the Ottoman system starts to stumble. Any serious military reform immediately clashes with the interests of the Janissaries. They are used to their payments, privileges, and influence on the streets and in the palace corridors. New regulations don't sound like progress to them. They feel like a threat to their status. The response is predictable. Sources report pressure on the viziers, conspiracies against those advocating for change, and unrest that starts not at the borders, but right in the barracks. Where strict discipline should prevail, lists of people to be removed are emerging, along with demands that grow louder. Documents from various years are lining up. The Sultan or the Vizier propose cutting payments, limiting military involvement in politics, and introducing new training protocols. In response, the barracks ignite. Armed squads pour into the city, the very ones meant to protect the capital and maintain order. And the demands are no longer about tactics or drills. Execute the advisors, replace the vizier, cancel the orders, and forget about reforms. The guard, created as a shield for power, gradually turns into a lever of pressure on that power. From this moment on, fear becomes the main filter for decisions. But it's not fear of Austria or Russia, nor fear of new weapons or foreign science. It's fear of their own army, fear of a rebellion at the heart of the empire. The sultans understand that a real attempt at reform could end not with a new charter, but with a new head on the chopping block. The state starts cutting back not on campaigns, but on changes. The risk of losing a war feels distant, stretched out in time, almost theoretical. The risk of an explosion in the capital is immediate, personal, and very real. The same choice comes up year after year: delay soften, or do nothing. Sometimes cities fall not because of the enemy's strength, but because of stubbornness from above. While the command center is afraid to change even a single line in the orders, people on the ground start to think that it's better to stay completely still. Any move feels suspicious. Any initiative seems like an unnecessary risk. The fear of reform turns into a fear of life itself. And here's where one mistake can cost an entire civilization. At first, those in power are afraid to challenge the status quo, admit their mistakes, or cancel decisions that no longer work. From that moment on, the enemy becomes the teacher. They learn faster, adapt quicker, and acknowledge their errors sooner. Then, the same people at the top become afraid not only to rethink the past, but also to take risks in the present, even when hesitation can be more costly than defeat. Documents from different eras repeatedly lead to one conclusion. It's safer to stay low today, even if it means risking tomorrow. Paper protects a career better than walls protect a city. And the thicker the folders filled with reports, the thinner the real defense becomes. Here stands a fortress. Stone, walls, towers. Behind them, there's not a dry garrison, but the last remnants of a world. Children, the elderly, craftsmen, merchants. Everything that remains of this people huddles against the stone, clinging to it as their final support. Here, the story quietly shifts. Outside, there's the enemy and their time. Inside, there's hope that somewhere above, there are people who know what to do. But on the wall, instead of a solution, there's a drawn-out duel of egos. It's not about strategy, it's a clash of pride. There's no common plan, just a debate over who is more important. One pushes for action, to go out, strike first, before the enemy gets a foothold. For him, defense feels like shame, a sign of weakness. He was raised in a culture of offense, believing in taking risks and striking first. The word siege sounds like a death sentence to him for those who are afraid. Another person clings to the walls as if behind them lies not stone, but his own life, not a step outside. This is where the story starts to ignite. We sit, wait, and let time weigh heavy. He remembers the land after battles, when the fields turned into a ditch of bodies. He believes in stone, warehouses, winter, and the enemy's diseases. I'm sure that if you don't play by someone else's rules, the fortress will stand strong. What he sees as caution, he believes is care. What he sees as fear, he thinks is wisdom. And both are convinced that they alone are the sensible ones. Each sees the other not as an ally, but as a threat. For the first, caution is cowardice and a hidden betrayal of the spirit of attack. For the second, determination is madness, throwing people into the grinder for someone else's glory. At some point, they are no longer fighting the besiegers, but each other. Orders start to contradict each other. Time is wasted on arguments instead of preparation. This is how empires don't just fall, they crack from within for a long time. Long before the rams and breaches in the walls. Internal division appears before the visible disaster. When personal grievances become more important than the common good. When fame, position, and wounded pride weigh more than the city behind you. That's when any plan breaks down over a simple, "I won't back down." Chronicles, reports, and accounts from different centuries tell the same story. Pride rings louder than any alarm. Worse than blindness in war is when everyone sees the danger and still walks into it. In every major failure, the scene plays out almost word for word. The information is there. It flows through communication channels, sits in files, and appears in briefings. People on the ground see it, record it, and warn others. But up top, they've already crafted a convenient version of reality. And anything that doesn't fit this picture gets tossed out as a mistake, panic, or unreliable data. These aren't stories about darkness or lack of intelligence. They're stories about how people deliberately silence their alarms. Intelligence reports come in. Officers raise warnings. The reports disrupt the neat narrative. But to acknowledge them means admitting that the plan could fall apart. And at that moment, many find it easier to turn a blind eye than to rewrite their own confidence. The analysis after a disaster almost always reveals the same pattern. First, a comforting thought emerges. The threat is exaggerated, the opponent won't take risks, they lack the strength and will. Reality starts to be shaped around this idea. Dangerous reports are pushed aside. Those who insist on the threat are labeled as alarmists. Concern shifts from being a safety tool to a personal accusation. The system begins to protect not people, but someone's illusions. Under Stalingrad, this became especially clear. There was information about Soviet troops on the flanks. They were gathered, summarized, and reported up the chain. The outlines of the future strike were already appearing on the maps. But at the top, there was a belief. There would be no major offensive in winter. The enemy was not ready. They were exhausted. The facts didn't disappear. They were pushed aside like an uncomfortable conversation that shakes confidence. Reality didn't match expectations, and reality was blamed, not the expectations. When the strike came, it wasn't sudden for the system. It was just inconvenient for its beliefs. A similar knot had tightened on the other side of the front, even before Stalingrad. Before Germany attacked the Soviet Union, the situation mirrored itself. Reports of troop concentrations at the border came in one after another. They noted the equipment, the trains, the airfields, and intercepted communications. The pieces of the puzzle formed a clear picture. An attack was being prepared. But up top, there was a different belief. Hitler wouldn't act now. It was more beneficial for him to wait. It wasn't about a lack of information. It was about the unwillingness to listen. The risk seemed less frightening than admitting a mistake in judging the enemy's intentions and the timing of an attack. The system chose to believe in a rational partner over the clear evidence of preparations for war. Investigating such failures leads to one root cause. It's not about a shortage of data, but rather the psychology behind decision-making. Once a commander falls in love with their own plan, everything around them starts to revolve around that love. They only notice what supports their idea. Everything else seems like noise, cowardice, or sabotage. Doubt is seen not as a safeguard, but as a personal insult. This creates a vicious cycle. The more dangerous the situation, the less willing they are to listen to those bringing bad news. In this context, the phrase, "everything is under control," stops being reassuring. They become like empires that don't fall with a single blow. They stubbornly ignore those who shout the truth in their faces. When those at the top think they understand the world down below, it still seems like life is going according to plan. The markets are buzzing, deals are happening, caravans are moving along the roads. Fortresses stand tall, warehouses are full. On paper, the army looks impressive. From the outside, everything appears stable. But inside the system, a nearly invisible shift begins. Enemies do not disappear. Threats do not vanish. What fades away is the willingness to acknowledge them. Information continues to flow. Intelligence tracks foreign troops. Patrols observe changing routes. Interpreters are sent to foreign capitals to grasp the tone of negotiations. Merchants sense rising prices for grain, metal, and wood, which means someone is preparing for a long war. Letters are intercepted. Dates are verified. New fortifications are marked on the map. The mosaic comes together to form a clear picture. Experienced people understand. This is not noise, it's a signal. Yet, between those who gather the facts and those who make the decisions, an invisible wall stands. At the very top, you often hear a simple phrase, "I don't believe." I don't believe the enemy will act. I don't believe they can hold on. I don't believe they will risk everything. This phrase becomes more important than numbers, reports, and briefings. This is how an empire heads toward the edge, not in a fog. She sees the sign that says, "End of the road," but she convinces herself that it's just someone else's fear. When historians sorted through dozens of these stories, one rule emerged. The longer a country lives without serious upheaval, the more calmly it views anxiety. The more victories it has behind it, the easier it brushes off bad news. Strength brings a special feeling. There are too many of us. We are too wealthy. We cannot be toppled with a single blow. Stability turns into a belief that tomorrow will be just like yesterday. It's this belief that makes us deaf to those who say, "The world around us has already changed." The Persian Empire during Darius's time is one such moment, a vast territory, streams of taxes, gold, roads, officials, armies. A system that works for years sends one clear message. This is the center of the world, and everything else is just the outskirts. But at the same time, troubling signs start to build up. A young Macedonian leader moves differently. He doesn't wait for the right moment. He creates it. He doesn't get bogged down in the luxury of campaigns. He maintains strict discipline. He isn't afraid of being outnumbered. He strikes not at the surface, but at the core. He doesn't seek a favorable peace. He aims for total victory. Officials bring reports to his camp. The pace of his advance, the balance of power. A list of cities that chose not to die for the old regime. The enemy's tactics break from the usual patterns. She seems bold, but not crazy. She's rational. However, there's a different logic at play up top. An empire is too big to be shaken by someone from a small country. Belief in scale becomes armor against reality. The bet is on the numbers. The idea is that the sheer amount of troops and resources will crush any attempt to break through. Sometimes empires don't fall by the sword, but by a handshake that once seemed like salvation. Those who yesterday called themselves partners are now shifting into predator mode. They're no longer pretending to respect boundaries or play nice. They're coming for what's theirs: the ports, the warehouses, the gold, and the power to decide what counts as the center of the world. This isn't a sudden betrayal or a story about friends stabbing each other in the back. The ground has been prepared for years, quietly, step by step. Every concession, every temporary privilege, every access to the inner workings of the empire did the same thing. It stripped the city of its armor. First, you give your ally the warehouses by the harbor, because it's faster and more profitable. Then, you grant them tax-free trade because you need their ships, and numbers start to matter more than soldiers. Next, you set up their own districts, markets, and temples because you have to respect your partner's interests. And soon, in the heart of your capital, a separate world begins to thrive. And with that choice, the bridges burn. It breathes your air, but it answers not to you, but to those across the sea who see your resources as theirs. The crusade that ultimately targets Constantinople doesn't come about overnight or get decided in a secret meeting. The strike becomes possible because the empire has highlighted all its vulnerabilities. It reveals where its walls are weak, who in the capital can be bribed, and how to cut off trade so the city suffocates without a siege or assault. When the Crusaders and Venetians reach the walls, it looks like a military operation. But essentially, this is an unveiling of a system that they have long had in their hands. They knew where the ships were, who controlled the docks and warehouses, and who was responsible for the debts. The city still believes that its status, history, and sanctity will save it, and this belief makes the fall harder. It believes that its own Christians will not go all the way, that they will not raise a hand against the sacred, and that they will not touch what has been considered untouchable for centuries. But the logic of money and debt is tougher than any faith, tougher than shared prayers and oaths. This is how the old balance falls apart, and history quietly shifts its course. Those who are used to making deals keep handing out promises, trading influence, and playing with titles and alliances. They still believe they can buy their way out, talk their way out, or outmaneuver the situation. But the moment has already passed. Those who once came as saviors are now doing cold calculations on the ruins. It's more profitable for them to plunder than to save, more beneficial to destroy the center than to support its remnants and deal with. So, victory turns into a trap, and yesterday's ally becomes the master of your fate. This isn't just the tragedy of one city or a random act of violence. It's a pattern that repeats throughout history, time and time again. First, the ally plugs the hole in your defense, and you still have a chance to turn things around. Then, they become that hole themselves, controlling it and turning your rear into their base. After that, you have two choices: live by their rules, or try to break free, paying a steep price for your escape. The military edge of this story. Any war falls apart, not in the trenches, but when someone closes a folder and pretends they haven't seen anything. Disaster always arrives quietly. At first, it's just a piece of paper with numbers and short phrases. No drama, no shouting, just a document that can be set aside for later. From this step, an entire world begins to crack. A room with no windows for outsiders. Dense air, a heavy scent of exhaustion. On the walls, there are maps, and on the table, neat folders. Outside, there are upbeat statements about resilience and victory. Inside, there are reports that leave a sober person staring blankly for a long time. Ammunition is running low. Units are depleted. Troop morale is falling. The enemy is stronger than expected. This isn't about emotions. It's not hysteria or an attempt to justify anything. This is the language of those who see war without parades and slogans. And this is where the real crime begins. Facts are clear. The data is straightforward. The wording is direct. But up top, they choose not to see. The history of different wars shows the same pattern. The names of countries, armies, slogans, and anthems change, but the scene stays the same. The administration fears delivering bad news. Staff rewrite reports until they are completely safe and soft. Those closest to the leader think not about the front lines, but about their own careers. Those who write honestly quickly find themselves under suspicion. Panic-stricken. Loser. Doesn't understand the political moment. This is how the first crack appears between the front lines and the capital. The report with the phrase, "We need to retreat, or we will be surrounded," doesn't disappear. It just gets pushed deeper into the drawer. It's shuffled around, marked "Return later." They discuss the wording instead of the essence. Meanwhile, time has already run out on the front. The headquarters, in the meantime, is building a paper reality. In it, losses are labeled as acceptable. A retreat is described as a maneuver to pre-prepared positions. Intelligence failures are attributed to limited initial information. Each report is a brick in the wall between truth and decisions. The longer the war drags on, the taller that wall becomes. It's harder to admit that the foundation has rotted long ago. At first, they round the numbers a bit. Then, they adjust the conclusions to meet the expectations of the higher-ups. Gradually, memos stop being a tool for understanding. They become a backdrop for internal use. When the archives are opened years later, the picture hits hard. It was clear very early on. Direct warnings were given early on. But they remained just words, not turning into action. Two documents land on the leader's desk. One contains an honest assessment: depleted resources, a weary society, and a lack of allies. The other is an upbeat text about having control over the situation and an imminent turning point. In reality, this is not a choice between plans, but between a painful truth and a comforting lie. The second document comes into play. From this point on, the system is no longer protecting the country. It's protecting its own image of infallibility. Bad news gets stuck in the hallways. Phrases are polished until they lose all their bite. Numbers are rounded off. Remember, Rome wasn't destroyed in a single night. It took a long time, and a lot of stubborn obedience to orders that led it to the edge. The empire is cracking, but the machinery of orders runs like clockwork. One emperor follows another. Everyone fears looking weak. Everyone signs papers that turn into the ruins of cities. Soldiers see what's happening. Veterans understand. The border is bare, the enemy is close, and the rear is empty. But the general is bound by orders. He might grumble in his tent, but at dawn he still leads the legions where he's told to go. This is how a strange double life is born. On paper, there are rules, regulations, and instructions. In reality, there's confusion, resentment, and a feeling of being sacrificed. Warriors start thinking not about Rome, but about themselves and their own units. Loyalty quietly begins to crack. When the center repeatedly abandons the provinces, those provinces learn to live without it. Local leaders make deals with enemies on their own. Legions pledge allegiance not to the empire, but to their general. And once again, the same formula that once brought down Qin comes into play. Where you can't say, stop, mistakes aren't corrected. They multiply. At some point, orders start to clash with reality. The empire demands taxes from devastated lands. It demands soldiers from those who are barely surviving. It demands loyalty where there is no protection or justice left. People are obeying less and less. Those who can are slipping into the shadows. The bolder ones are switching sides to whoever is strong at the moment. The authorities respond with even more pressure. The cycle tightens. The more fear there is, the less sense it makes. This is what slow suicide of a state looks like. It's not just one fateful day or one final battle, but a series of decisions that no one dares to stop. China and Rome never met, but their endings are painfully similar. There, fires burn those who can think. Here, orders break those who can defend. In both cases, the system faithfully follows its own commands. Correctly, consistently, right to the end. She punishes those who doubt and rewards those who stay silent and comply. At some point, it becomes clear, the enemy is no longer outside. The enemy is within, in the very logic of control, in the rules that cannot be broken, in the orders that cannot be questioned. History gives us a stark lesson. There is a line beyond which obedience stops being a virtue. When an order leads a country to the brink, following it becomes not a duty, but a participation in the downfall. But they still follow such orders, because fear is closer than the future, because everyone thinks that their little yes doesn't change anything, because it's easier to take a step forward with the instructions than to stop and say one word, no. Empires don't fall when the enemy enters the capital. They fall earlier, when there are no longer people inside who are willing to risk themselves for common sense. Empires often die not on the battlefield, but in the halls of power. Outside, troops are still marching, trumpets are sounding, and coins are being minted. But inside, a quiet war of all against all is already underway. The army may formally obey the center, but each general is playing their own game. Borders are waiting for orders, while the capital is only focused on itself. The most dangerous moment is when the enemy is still far away, but the state is already divided. Forts are standing, garrisons are in place, and reports are coming in on schedule. It seems like everything is working as planned. But every decision at the top is driven not by the country's defense, but by the fear of losing power. Officials, military leaders, and the ruler's inner circle start to lose sight of the bigger picture. For them, borders matter less than influence, positions, and access to the treasury. Orders become tools of intrigue. Armies move not where danger lies, but where power is at stake. This is how the shield of the empire begins to tear from within. Parts are taken from the borders to strengthen the capital. Garrison forces are fading, fortresses are emptying, and defense becomes just an illusion. The enemy doesn't break through the walls. They simply go where there are no defenders left. Late Rome lived this way. Documents were issued, taxes were collected, and roads were in use. But every major general saw themselves as the future emperor. The legions that were meant to hold back the barbarians got drawn into campaigns against their own people. The border on the Danube had become just a blank line on the map. The barbarians watched as the best troops left, as Roman leaders argued, and as they fought for the throne. They didn't need to break the supply lines or spy. All they had to do was wait for the empire to get distracted by its own problems. By the time the Visigoths entered Rome, the city had been falling for many years. Each coup took a bite out of the shared obedience. The united army was breaking apart into the personal forces of different lords. The soldier was not thinking about the state, but about the person he served. The uniform remained, but the substance faded away. The empire was still recorded in the chronicles, but it was no longer a unified will. The central decision-making was blurred by a chain of conspiracies. At that moment, an external invasion became not the cause, but the final point. A similar scenario unfolded in the Arab Caliphate. At first, there was one faith, one ruler, and one chain of command. Border fortresses knew they were backed by a united state. Armies moved as one, and decisions were clear and straightforward. Then the struggle for power began. Dynastic conflicts split the land into rival centers. Several capitals emerged, each trying to pull the blanket in its direction. Troops found themselves torn between loyalties and benefits. Commanders chose not the best position, but the most promising patron. Yesterday's allies were now facing each other as enemies. The shared territory was turning into a patchwork of private lands. Each piece was focused on itself, rather than the whole system. The borderlands were no longer a shield. Local rulers were slowly slipping out of control. At first, they ignored orders. Then, they stopped paying. And eventually, they began to gather their own armies. Thus, the internal struggle gradually replaced the external defense. Empires don't fall when they are attacked. They fall when they believe they are invulnerable. At that moment, the world still seems stable, but cracks are already forming inside. On the outside, everything looks the same: flags, parades, loud speeches. But if you dig into the archives, letters, and personal notes, it becomes clear that the belief of "nothing can touch us" always comes long before disaster strikes. This thought starts off cautiously, almost as a whisper. Then it gets repeated in reports, reinforced in speeches, and integrated into school formulas. Gradually, it shifts from being an opinion to a rule of life. At this point, the empire loses its fear, and with that, fear goes its caution. The management is still functioning, but it's no longer listening. The top begins to play its own games, forgetting that the world around them is changing. Leaders convince themselves that any losses are temporary and any failures are just misunderstandings. Any alarming signal is explained away as a coincidence, a conspiracy, or enemy propaganda. This creates the main drug of late empires, a sense of invulnerability. Sources show that the more those in power talk about eternity, the less strength they have to tackle real issues. While those at the top argue about symbols and status, the mechanisms that hold everything together are crumbling below. The administration is overloaded, decisions are delayed, and orders get lost along the way. People on the ground are starting to find their own ways around the rules, coming up with semi-legal survival schemes. On paper, the system still looks unified, but in reality, it's not. Each new crisis is met not with analysis, but with rituals. Committees are formed, stern statements are issued, and campaigns are announced. But behind the reports and slogans, there's no real resource, no time, and no will to make genuine changes. This leads to growing fatigue. You can see it in private messages, in closed reports, and in the memoirs of those who held the reins. People at the top feel like they are losing control, but they can't admit it. Any acknowledgement of weakness seems like a step toward failure, so they speed up their own downfall. History records the same phrases across different centuries. Everything is under control. The situation is stable. There is no reason for concern. Each time, these statements come just before a turning point. The louder those in power talk about strength, the clearer it becomes. Their power is already slipping away. At this time, the enemies have not yet delivered a decisive blow. They are testing the waters, probing, and making mistakes. But the empire allows them the luxury of learning from these mistakes. Instead of reassessing the threat, It clings to old beliefs. This creates a gap between the real world and the picture the leadership believes in. This gap grows over the years. At first, propaganda hides it, then fear, and finally, simple inertia. Everyone knows something is off, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. The military, intelligence agencies, and bureaucracy start focusing on reports. Numbers that look good go up the chain. Problems get pushed aside, turned into private issues or temporary difficulties. The empire can still exert pressure, punish, and intimidate, but it has almost forgotten how to adapt. Often, it's not enemies that bring down empires. They drive themselves into a wall and don't stop. The story of these people feels like a hall of titans. On the outside, they are geniuses, demigods, masters of the world. Their names turn into myths. Their decisions become legends. But if you strip away the glamour, what remains is a stubborn, almost childlike, "I won't back down." Inside, they are people who, at a crucial moment, couldn't tell themselves a simple word: stop. Investigations reveal that they weren't brought down by conspiracies, miracle weapons, or curses. They were undone by their own belief that they couldn't be wrong. If you take away the drama, the situation becomes almost painfully simple. Every major failure has a point where you can still turn back. But at that point, experience starts to blind you. A person who is used to winning trusts their past luck more than the reality in front of them. You don't need a brilliant plan, and you don't need a miracle. You only need to admit that you can't go on. The cost is already too high. And it's at this moment that the strongest people can feel the weakest. They cling to the image of being infallible like it's a throne. Xerxes marched into Greece as a man who believed the world should bow down to him. He led an empire that seemed endless. Up until Salamis, everything confirmed his worldview. If he wanted something, he got it. Cities surrendered, armies retreated, and roads opened up for him. But the naval defeat shattered this logic. His fleet was destroyed, the initiative slipped away, and the Greeks had no intention of submitting to the Persians. The war is turning into a sticky trap, where the empire is pouring in people and resources. The empire is getting tired, but it's not broken yet. This is where it could have stopped. Here's the crossroads. He could pull back the main army, secure what's already been taken, and move to negotiations. He could maintain the status of a superpower without tearing the country apart. He could give the empire a breather, strengthen its leadership, and plug the resource gap. But he pushes on, as if human resources are endless. He doesn't acknowledge that the bet on total victory has failed. On the outside, the state still seems monumental, but inside, cracks are already forming. In a few generations, Alexander will walk through these seams, finishing what Xerxes couldn't hold. This pattern will repeat over and over. Centuries, languages, and armies may change, but the key moment remains the same: the choice to stop and the refusal to do so. Each time at the center is one person who puts their "I will not back down" above the survival of the system. Hannibal approaches his moment of choice. He strikes Rome like it has never been struck before. Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. The Republic is drowning in losses, and old certainties are crumbling. After Cannae, the door to the enemy's heart is slightly open. Rome is stunned, and its allies are uncertain. The choice is clear and harsh. Crush the enemy now with a blow to the center, or stretch out the war, hoping the system will collapse under the weight of fear and expenses. Hannibal chooses a slow strangulation. He believes that Rome's allies will switch sides in large numbers. Some do pull away, but the core remains strong. The city doesn't fall. It tightens and learns. The empire's chance of losing isn't on the battlefield. They first defeat themselves in their minds. Our investigation started off calmly. We were just going through old campaigns. We flipped through reports, letters, and briefings. We looked at others' mistakes like they were museum exhibits. Cannes, Napoleon in Russia, Stalingrad, the colonial wars of the 19th century. In this lineup, history seemed to cling to neutrality. We faced maps, names, dates, and numbers, cold tables of losses, foreign signatures sealing the fates of entire armies. At first, it all looked like a collection of separate tragedies, unrelated to each other. But as we dug deeper into the archives, the feeling grew stronger. We were reading the same script, just with different backdrops. Here, numbers have become more important than soldiers. Flags, anthems, capitals, and faces in portraits change. The names of operations, the cut of uniforms, the color of tanks, and the shape of medals all shift. Yet the ending feels like it's been rewritten from the same manuscript, where the final chapters can't be changed. Rome, Persia, Carthage, the empires of Napoleon and Hitler, the naval powers of the 19th century. Every time, it's the same moment. Victory smoothly turns into a trap. Different eras, different continents, different armies. But the handwriting of defeat remains almost the same. Step by step, fear at the top replaces common sense. And this is what scares generals today much more than new missiles, drones, and loud statements. Because this isn't about the distant past. It's about those who are currently sitting in offices, leaning over maps, signing orders, and only listening to those who tell them what they want to hear. Their decisions are already heading to the same archive where old wars are stored. The first harsh conclusion is uncomfortable. It's not the enemy that breaks the army, but the pride at the top. We've seen this pattern repeated in documents from different centuries. As soon as the commander-in-chief focuses on their own genius instead of winning, the countdown to defeat has already begun. At first, it's almost unnoticeable. It's all about prestige, the unacceptability of retreat, and the firmness of the line. But the mechanism is already in motion. If you can't admit a mistake, you stretch out the defeat. If you can't step back in time, you drag your army into the snow, into the desert, into trap cities. This is how campaigns fail, how reserves burn out, how units that could still be saved disappear. The second lesson is that you can't live inside your own mythology. Power quickly gets used to the story of its uniqueness and mission. Gradually, the story pushes reality aside. On maps, everything looks beautiful. In reports, everything is perfect. And in speeches, everything is unbeatable. Empires were sure that wild enemies would scatter at the sight of their formations. Samurai elites believed that spirit was stronger than factories and assembly lines. Colonial armies viewed their opponents as mere statistics. But believing in their own superiority didn't make their armor thicker, didn't extend their resources, and didn't shorten the way back. The third lesson is that underestimating your opponent is almost always more costly than being overly cautious. Rome realized too late that the barbarians were not just noise from outside, but the future rulers of its own cities. The Persian elite missed the signs. Empires rarely die in battle. More often, they simply stop noticing that they are already dead. The most deceitful part of an empire's end is the feeling that everything is under control, even when there is emptiness inside. Old chronicles always show the same scene: burning cities, panic, foreign flags over fortresses, and people running. It seems like disaster struck suddenly, like a lightning bolt on a clear day. But if we rewind the tape in our minds, the picture changes. The real breakdown began long before the siege and assault. The leader loses touch with reality, not at the moment the capital falls, but in the silence of the offices, in the everyday decisions that no one wanted to take seriously, in the issues that were shoved into drawers and postponed for later, in the behind-the-scenes agreements that were called temporary. But then for years, everyone pretended that was how it should be. It's easy to get into the habit of not touching anything that still holds together, just to avoid taking risks. This raises an uncomfortable question. Does an empire fall the day enemies enter the capital, or when it stops telling itself the truth? Rome didn't collapse overnight. It decayed from within for a long time, until external blows finally finished off its weakened body. Corruption stopped shocking people and became the background noise. Intrigue took the place of strategy. Military leaders focused more on their careers and personal safety than on borders. The army split into factions, driven by money and personal loyalty. Emperors changed so frequently that power itself lost its value. On paper, they continued to write about greatness, mission, and glory. Failures were explained away as temporary difficulties and the enemy's cunning. When the barbarians arrived, it was no longer a siege. It was like entering a house where the doors hadn't been repaired, and the locks hadn't been checked in a long time. The same pattern appears where people tend to blame everything on one clever trick from the enemy. The story of Troy is often reduced to the wooden horse. It's a neat story, a smart deception, a naive victim, and a sudden strike. But if we look beyond the legend and focus on the city itself, the picture changes. Troy is a worn-out city, drained from a long siege. People are living on the edge. Fatigue has become the norm, and hope for a miracle is the last excuse. When a system is cornered, any unusual opportunity feels like salvation. They are presented with a way out of the deadlock, a big symbolic gift at the gate. They grab onto it because there is nothing left to believe in. The crucial moment isn't the arrival of the horse, but the decision to let it in almost without scrutiny. The key decision is made by their own, not by an enemy. The logic repeats itself over and over. An external blow becomes deadly only where the inside has already given up on clarity and self-control. The Inca Empire seemed like a perfect order. Smooth roads, warehouses, a strict hierarchy, centralized control. A system that appeared to leave no room for chaos. And then, suddenly, a small group of outsiders, after which the whole structure collapses. From the outside, it looks like a clash of two worlds. A powerful civilization against a tiny squad. It's easy to explain it all away as a miraculous advantage of technology and boldness.